Hello, everyone. I am Jacob Remes. I am trying to stop my screen sharing. I am Jacob Remes. I am a faculty member here at NYU Gallatin School of Individualized Study. I want to thank all of you for coming here, for spending your Friday afternoon with us for this first public event of the Initiative for Critical Disaster Studies. Before we get started, I want to do kind of a difficult land acknowledgement. One of the things about Zoom is that we are all on different lands and on the land of different peoples. But I want to acknowledge that NYU and Gallatin are on the ancestral and traditional land of the Lenape people, and also to acknowledge the many indigenous people from many peoples who do and continue to live and work, and especially relevant for today's event, to build and have built New York City and to make it a continuing vital indigenous city. And I also want to thank a lot of people at Gallatin and elsewhere, Dean Suzanne Wofford, Associate Dean Hillary Kleine for their unstinting support in helping to build the initiative, Linda Reese and Gisela Humphreys and Mike West for taking care of the financial and administrative parts of this talk, Teresa Anderson and Casey Trummer for helping to put it together and get the word out. Jen Burge, who as always is running the technical magic behind the scene that is letting you see this, and Susan McMurray at the Toronto and York Region Labor Council, who has been a pleasure in arranging this. So thank you to all of you, and thank you to all of you in the audience who I can't see for being here. So I want to, before I introduce today's speaker, I want to briefly introduce the Initiative for Critical Disaster Studies, which is hosting today's event. Critical Disaster Studies is kind of a new and growing field that brings together scholars and students and activists from a variety of different fields. One of my collaborators, Andy Horowitz, likes to talk about critical disaster studies as an interdisciplinary intersection rather than a disciplinary objective. But we start from a variety, we start from kind of a set of core ideas about disaster. So first, that disasters are political, by which we mean both that they are sites of politics, but also that the very designation of something as a disaster is a political judgment, a judgment that that type of suffering is abnormal and out of place, as opposed to the daily quotidian suffering that happens all the time that is in place and okay and doesn't deserve or doesn't get the same sort of attention that things that we designate a disaster are. So in some ways, critical disaster study starts from the very questioning of the utility of the category that we are studying. The second thing is that disasters are embedded in time and in their own time and place, which is to say that disasters are slow, that they are not, as we often imagine them to be, these quick, specific moments, but that they are stretched out over time. And this is often where climate change comes into the question, where we think about a disaster, a hurricane, a flood, a heat wave as being a specific event. But in fact, the disaster that really is has been going on for a long time, both in the past and in the present. And finally, one of the things that we're trying to do with the Initiative for Critical Disaster Studies is to understand disaster through learning from the people who are closest to the trouble and working with activists and organizers to learn from them and to think about the knowledge that activists and organizers create in their daily work that is part of understanding disaster. So with that in mind, I want to just let you know before we start today's event about the events that we have coming up as part of this series. So I will share my screen again. So we are having 2 more speakers in this series, New Ideas in Climate Change in Critical Disaster Studies. A month from today, we will hear from Jacqueline Patterson, who is the Senior Director of the NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. And then on April 16th, we are going to hear from Richard Mizell, who is a historian at the University of Houston. I think they're going to be really great talks. You can, as soon as we are done today, you can go to the Gallatin events page and RSVP for them so that you can put them on your calendar, get a reminder when they're going to happen and not even think about it again. The other event that is coming up sooner on March 12th, and this is, those last two events are open to everyone. I hope everyone who is here will come. On March 12th, we have something for NYU students in particular, Flooding Heritage and Emergency Salvage Response Primer. That is something that the initiative is working on together with two other parts of Gallatin, Wet Lab and Stack. We are bringing in, by the magic of Zoom, we are zooming in conservators from the British Columbia Heritage Emergency Response Network for a training about how to save, how to salvage flooded heritage objects. So if you are a student and you are interested in taking part in that, again, please register for the Gallatin events page. That's going to be really fun. I hope I will see you there. So with that, I want to introduce today's speaker, John Cartwright, who I'm really pleased and honored is the first speaker, is the first event for the initiative. About a year and a half ago, I was at a conference in Mississauga, at the University of Toronto at Mississauga, and didn't really know anyone at the conference, so I was going to all of the events and went to one of the keynote talks, and it was a labor leader who gave a tremendously inspirational talk about the need for and possibility for a worker-led transition from climate. And I said, as this talk was going on, as it finished, that this was someone who I wanted to learn more from and do more with. And that person was, you can guess, John Cartwright. And so I'm really pleased and honored that he has agreed to come and talk to us. John Cartwright is a carpenter. He is the past leader of the Central Ontario Building Trades Council. In 2001, he was elected to be president of the Toronto and York Region Labor Council, which is the fourth or fifth largest local labor council in North America. It represents 220,000 members in Canada's largest urban center. John is also the national chair of the Council of Canadians, which is the leading Canadian social action organization fighting for clean water, fair trade, public health care, and a vibrant democracy. He's also vice chair of the Greater Toronto United Way. In preparing for this introduction, I went to the Toronto Star and searched for his name and was kind of overwhelmed at the wide variety of topics in which he has been a leader. So he has led in fights for public education, public transit, the right to water, clean water, and electricity. He is involved in anti-racism work, including against carding, which is the Canadian version of stop and frisk. He has fought in electoral politics fights for worker rights. He led a successful campaign to raise the Ontario minimum wage. And most of all, he is a leader within the labor movement for a just transition from carbon. And it is that he is going to speak to us today. So if we were all together in a room, I would ask you to clap and welcome him, but instead just please welcome John Cartwright. Thank you, John.
Thank you all and welcome. Good afternoon. I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. Toronto, as it was first called, it's subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty between the Anishinaabe Mississaugas and the Hautestonis that we try to honor. And in Canada, we have a very long journey called Truth and Reconciliation that we are attempting to undertake with Indigenous peoples here. Just to let you know, in Toronto, we've come from 194 countries, we speak 100 languages, and we live in relative harmony because people here have made some really tough and important decisions. My parents, like the vast majority of Torontonians, came from somewhere else looking for a better life. They came from the north of England, from the coal mining and cotton mill towns in Lancashire. And I was born in London, Ontario, but moved to Scarborough, which is like your Brooklyn, when I was 13. Not long after that, I was listening to a radio program about the civil rights movement, about the Jim Crow laws, about the horrific reality of racism in the South. And I was so angered that people could be treated like that. It didn't make any sense to me. I was in the Army Reserves here as an infantry sergeant and training with people who'd trained with others who'd been in Vietnam, and met people who'd come to Canada as war resistors who'd been in Vietnam. And as I heard the stories of villages being napalmed and women and children's lives that didn't seem to matter, and the conclusion, because it was the color of people's skin, those two things have burned in my soul ever since, and is part of our commitment to challenge systemic racism in our world. I started my trade at the age of 18, working in cabinet shops, making furniture. And I'll always remember one day we heard the voice of a foreman saying, "You're fired." And we looked around, we couldn't believe it, because he was speaking to Joe, a very highly skilled German cabinet maker that had been with that company since it had started. And we were all sure, we didn't have a union, we were all sure as soon as the owner came back after lunch, he would rectify the situation. He came back after lunch and backed up his supervisor, and Joe put his toolbox on his shoulder and walked out in disgrace of a shop that he'd worked in since it started. And at that moment in time, I pledged that if I was going to work with my hands for a living, I was going to get a union so that I could have respect and dignity in the workplace. I did get into the union. I became a construction worker, and eventually I became a rep with the Carpenters Union. And a good friend of mine, Neil Borland, was an insulator. Those are people who work insulating pipes and boilers in industrial systems and commercial centers. And they were using, of course, that miracle substance called asbestos. Well, Neil died a long and lingering death from mesothelioma, like so many others who've been told this is a miracle fiber that we could use safely. And as I thought about Neil's passing, I pledged that I would fight for health and safety. And in fact, much of the environmental activism in the labor movement today comes from a health and safety background. I found out a little later that I was addressing cancer. I'm a cancer survivor now because the crap that I use, the toxic chemicals I used for the first 10 years of my working life were full of toluene and benzene and directly connected to lymphoma that was running through my blood and my bone marrow. Those kinds of things sit with you and tell you that you want to act in a way that makes a difference. So I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide, the one with the fires. In 2015, I was honored to be in Paris for the COP21, the United Nations climate gathering that ended up committing the world to limiting CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions so we wouldn't raise above 2 degrees more. And there were a lot of trade unions at that gathering. And one of them was named Ken Smith. We had a meeting of just trade union activists from all around this globe, about 300 of us in a room. And Ken got up. Ken Smith was the leader of the workers at the tar sands in northern Alberta, the dirtiest energy in the world. And he was the elected president of a local union with 4,000 members. He got up and he said, you know, people ask me, if I'm an oil worker and I need to represent my members, how can you be here talking about committing to dramatic reduction of CO2 emissions, of climate justice? And he said, I was a zinc miner in New Brunswick in Eastern Canada before, but the mine ran out. And like many of my neighbors, we came to Alberta to try and make a better life. And I tell this story to my fellow members. I say, just imagine you've got a decent life here now, you're making decent money, you got a house on the edge of town, and you're You've got a great family, your wife and your two kids, and then one day a forest fire breaks out, and that fire threatens your home. And you and your wife and your two kids grab everything you can in your arms to run away from that fire. And you keep running, but the fire pursues you. And as you run, you come to a river. And now you have a choice. You kind of throw away everything you've been able to get to try and swim across the river. You could stand or perish. Or if you'd started earlier, you could have built a bridge. People in that room were so taken with that analogy that we could build a bridge. And there's no small irony that a year later, Ken was taking his family into his vehicle and driving away from one of the largest forest fires in Canadian history that surrounded Fort McMurray in Alberta in the tar sands. And that reminds us that this is not going to be a simple journey. The Labor Council that I'm honored to lead has been around since 1871. We were 150 years in our existence. And when that small group of people that started our Labor Council got together, they were looking at how do we have enough power, not just to talk about the money we earn, but about a better world? How do we win economic and social justice? And in our movement in Canada, we've always had a perspective that what we want for ourselves, we wish for all. We've wanted universal social programs, universal programs that all Canadians can benefit from, not just union members. After 1947, seeing the horrors of the Holocaust and the impact of systemic racism and the anti-colonial struggles that were happening around the world, our labor movement in Toronto started to add racial justice to its core role. We created a Toronto Joint Labor Committee on Human Rights that went on to fight systemic discrimination, and in fact won the first human rights legislation in North America, here in Ontario, within a few years. And in the last 20 years, we've added climate justice, because we understand that people can try and tell us it's either jobs or the environment, but the reality is there's no jobs on a dead planet, and we'd rather have the right choice. If you can go to the next slide. This is the Trade Union Forum on Climate Jobs that I just talked about, that Ken Smith spoke so eloquently. And in that conversation, we talked about the three crises facing humankind: the jobs and economic inequality crisis, the climate crisis, and the crisis of racial injustice. And that if we are to have a strategy to address what's wrong in our world, we have to have the solutions that weave through to justice to answer all three of those things. You know, this is a city, majority of us were born outside of Canada. We say since the First Nations gave us the name Toronto, this is a city forged by generation after generation of immigrants and refugees and their descendants. But like you in the States, we've had those conversations about refugees. We've had conservatives, politicians trying to whip up anger and fear about refugees. And we have some very interesting history. Can you go to the next slide, please? In 1847, Toronto was a city of 20,000 people. In 1 year, 38,000 strangers arrived upon our shores. They spoke a different dialect, they had a different religion, they had huge families, and they were highly rumored to be prone to violence. You know who I'm talking about. The Irish fleeing the famine. The famine where English-owned farms were exporting food to get money at a market that would pay more for that food. And we can't have a conversation about climate justice without understanding the other elements of our world. Some years ago, I was in Barcelona, Spain, and along the beautiful beach there was a huge memorial. And on the top of this was a number. It was like a clock in a sports arena where the numbers change from time to time. The number was 3507. And underneath it, it said in Spanish and Catalan and English, this is not just a number, these are people. The Mediterranean, a meeting point of cultures and civilizations, has now become an enormous mass grave for thousands of people without shelter who are seeking protection. We do not know their names or their personal stories, but we do know how many they are. We would like to count them so we can pay tribute to them and never forget them. Barcelona will never cease its demand for a legal and safe passage to Europe and a change of course in asylum policies. We are and will be a refuge city. I was so struck by that public expression by the city of Barcelona of that reality that you're looking at on the screen, and our obligation as human beings to resolve the kinds of things that are involved in the push-pull of migration and refugees. There's something like 70 million people today in our world who are refugees. Then come out of nowhere. They come out of the dynamics of global capitalism, out of the impact of trade deals, the legacy of colonialism, structural adjustment programs, armed conflict, including proxy wars, and yes, climate disasters. And we know that the war in Syria, as you peel back the causes, the massive droughts caused by changing climate, were part of the dynamics that created that horrific civil war. When we look at globalization, people sometimes say, well, this is a new thing. We've got the Amazons and the Ubers and some of the global companies. There's a whole new thing about corporate globalization. And some of us say, well, actually, not really. All of us have to come to grips with the reality of the transatlantic slave trade, whether you're in the States or the Caribbean, which is where most of those enslaved peoples came to, or you're part of the British economy that owned the largest number of slaving ships, or you're involved in any other part of the world. We've got to deal with that. But corporate globalization actually started in 1602. The Dutch East India Company was the first joint stock corporation in the world. And it had three elements in its charters of incorporation. The first was that they would go to unconquered lands and claim those lands in the name of the company, not the Crown of Holland, in the name of the company. The second, that they would raise a body of armed men in order to enforce their rule. And the third was that they would enslave indigenous peoples to work on the plantations, to provide an 18% return on investment for 2 centuries. A business model that included in the charter enslavement of peoples, 18% return on investment over 2 centuries. The British weren't far behind. Those of you who know the history of South Asia, the British East India Company had 100,000 men under arms as they conquered piece after piece after piece of the Indian subcontinent in the name of the company, not the crown. And here in Canada, the largest private landowner in the world was the Hudson's Bay Company, issued a charter by the British Crown that took indigenous lands of all watersheds that flowed into Hudson's Bay that actually became the largest private landowner in the world. Now that model of global corporate globalization, I should say, is something that humankind has struggled with ever since. And when you look back in our history as people, the slave revolts were about saying no to that model. The anti-colonial struggles were about people saying we want a different outcome. Workers' rights struggles in the early trade union movements, the suffrage movements to get the vote and win democracy, the women's movement in a century ago and since, the revolutions that took place after the First World War, and the first labor laws, significant labor laws in the 1930s and 40s, were all about limiting the rights of corporations to govern us in their interest and to say that human rights has to be balanced with that. And after World War II, the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which of course was signed in your city, New York, in 1948, was a huge achievement of the moral compass of humankind, that we would put human rights and people's rights in front of the drive for profit and power. And then the civil rights movement, the women's movements, the health and safety movement, and the environmental movement. And today, particularly in Canada and other parts of of the Americas, the rights, the struggle for indigenous rights are all part of limiting the behavior of corporations as they do bad things and try and say they have to do things that are more accountable to humankind. That's a bigger picture. I'm going to come back to the tar sands in Canada. And the tar sands, as I said, is the dirtiest oil in the world. And it's up in a patch of indigenous land that is very lightly populated before they discovered that you could dig up bitumen, melt it down, and create a product. And the workforce from the tar sands have pretty well all come from elsewhere, including people like Ken Smith. But in the 1990s, when the world was looking at the Kyoto Accord, one of the first major international accords to talk about reducing the impact of pollution, the union of those tar sand workers, communications energy paper workers, realized that they wanted to sign on to Kyoto and support that drive for a clean economy alternatives, because their members were in pulp and paper, they were in energy, they were in oil refining, they were in plastics, they were in communications. And they, like the great work of the oil, chemical, and atomic workers in the States, wanted to have clean alternatives and still have jobs. And they decided as a union, they were going to endorse the Kyoto Accord. They asked me to help organize a major event in Toronto where they would explain that. And we brought hundreds of trade unionists to that event. And they said, you know, we as a union wanted to do that, but we couldn't do that without the conversation first being with our own members in the tar sands, because otherwise it would not have legitimacy. It couldn't be telephone workers in Toronto or pulp workers in British Columbia saying, we want to move to a lower emissions future. We had to start with the workers at the very tip of this production. And we sat down and had that conversation about how resources are boom bust economy, how those corporations care nothing about the families that are making the money today, because there's so many spaces in Canada, across the world, where the resource economy has pillaged an area and left people behind with nothing. And they won the support of those workers, and they went across their union across this whole country to win the support of their workers for adopting Kyoto. That was pretty damn neat. And the Steelworkers Union in the States, a guy called Dave Foster, took the same kind of approach as he was thinking about building the Blue-Green Alliance. We were starting to move to a new consensus of what was possible. Next slide, please. We started asking ourselves these questions. What happens if we fail on climate change? And we've got a bunch of answers from workers from very different kinds of sector of the economy. These are all union members you're going to see on these slides in a minute. With the understanding, as in any fundamental injustice, if we don't fix it, we're going to pay much more later. We were starting to come to that understanding, and then new political forces started to launch a huge counterattack against the consensus reached with the Paris Accord and Kyoto and the Paris Accord. The billionaires who are running coal, petroleum, and mining empires, they funded Donald Trump. They funded the Tea Party, not just the Koch brothers, but many others. They funded right-wing political candidates all across this world. And in some places, they are joined by land speculators and agribusiness, so the worst cowboy capitalists that we see in the world, and we witness that in Brazil, but many other places in our world today. These people refuse to acknowledge the reality of environmental racism or the intense degradation of land and water. Instead, the oil lobbyists have crafted a narrative that we have to have prosperity or people will be left behind. And in our country, as they're talking about moving the tar sands, it's about we have to get resources to tidewater or you'll be betraying the people of Alberta. Sadly, their success in posing those kinds of questions was actually highlighted by our government, Liberal government, buying and approving a Trans Mountain pipeline project to export oil to Asia, and the province of Alberta buying the Keystone pipeline as it was failing and spending billions of dollars of public money to try and move the world's dirtiest oil down to the southern states. Next slide, please. So this is a roofer. He's a member of my home local union, Carpenters Local 27. And This brother actually believes that we have to take action on climate. And he wanted his picture up on a roof that he does, and we have very high level of unionization in Toronto. These are union jobs. And pointing out that, you think you can cut corners, but at the end of it, you're going to pay more. And to him, the analogy is if your roof leaks, you're not just going to replace the roof, you're going to be taking out all the carpet and drywall and furniture below. And if you don't fix the right thing, you're going to pay much more. There's people who tell us that taking action could hurt the economy. And as I said before, our response in the labor movement is there are no jobs on a dead planet. If humanity is to survive, we have to challenge those powerful corporate interests that relentlessly press governments around the world to expand fossil fuel extraction and pursue unlimited consumerism. Next slide, please. There's a saying about change that we have, and that's that transition is assured, but justice is not. As we've seen changes in the economy, witnessed out hollowed communities and poverty wage jobs left, whether it's manufacturing. We lost about a third of all manufacturing jobs in Greater Toronto when the US-Canada free trade deal was brought in, and you lost millions of good manufacturing jobs after NAFTA and globalization has unfolded. That's why the principle of just transition has to be embedded in any plan for climate action. There's lots of examples of past injustice, and today's disruptive economies are set to displace or change far more jobs than environmental regulations will ever do. And going back to my friend Ken Smith, as the oil companies up there were screaming about to oil workers, you better stand and defend the tar sands and defend our corporate profits, they were planning to wipe out over 800 jobs just by replacing workers with driverless trucks to move that product to the process fields. But if this is just a discussion for the elites, like the Trudeaus in our country, and frankly, the way the Clintons brought in some of the globalization agenda, we're going to lose the political battle. You saw that with the rise of Trump. We've seen that with the rise of right-wing populism all across the world. Next slide, please. We've got to figure out the solutions. One of my oldest friends is one of the leaders of equity and anti-racist work in Toronto and in Ontario. And he taught me a lesson a long time ago. If you want to bring about a program of employment equity, of taking away systemic barriers to people of color, to getting decent jobs and working, in order for the existing workforce to accept that idea that other people will come in and sometimes move at a different pace, they have to feel a sense of security and respect. Because if they feel insecure, the backlash will be formidable. But you also have to look at the pool of qualified candidates differently. And in the same way, we have to look at the political and economic choices differently. This notion of just transition, that if you're going to change our economy to move to low carbon, that working people and their communities must be looked after, it's slowly being embraced at the international level. In 2015, we could not get it in the main body of the text of the Paris Accord, but subsequent COP meetings of the United Nations have started to embed the concept of just transition into the recognition globally that that's got to be a core part of the process. In 2019, Canada struck a just transition task force for coal workers and coal communities. It was co-chaired by Lois Corbett, a longtime environmentalist from the Maritimes, and Hassan Youssef, who is the president of our Canadian Labour Congress, our central labor body in this country. And they understood that there's no doubt this is going to take hard work, and there's examples that we can look to guide us the way. One of those examples for us is the health and safety movement. I mentioned before my own experience around unsafe work, but as a construction worker, it's also the immediate hazards as well as the long term. 50 years ago, workers in Canada and the States started a serious effort to build a health and safety movement to challenge the accepted norms of workplace accidents and deaths. And we had to confront employers and politicians. We had to educate our members, that we had to fight for regulations, and we had to win laws for the implementation of workplace health and safety committees. That meant we had a voice in the workplace about pointing out what was dangerous and finding solutions. Together with allies in the medical professions and enlightened employers, we succeeded dramatically in reducing fatalities and occupational disease. And that lessons of that journey is what we want to apply again to the issues of just transition. In the 1990s, I became the head of the building trades in Toronto. It was a terrible time for anybody to step up in that leadership role. We had experienced the worst recessions in the dirty 30s. All across the eastern seaboard, a third of construction workers were out of work, a third of our members losing homes, families breaking up, suicides, terrible unemployment. People were desperate for a job. They wanted a mega project of any kind. We were lobbying for anything we could find to put those people back to work. And we sat down with some very thoughtful and visionary environmental leaders, a couple of engineers, and a couple of city councillors, New Democratic city councillors, that's our Labour Party in Canada, and mapped out the concept that our city could play a leading role in bringing those jobs back, not by paving new farmland or building higher high-rises, but to look at the building stock that was there, that were built at a time when energy was irrelevant, the cost was irrelevant, and retrofitting those massive buildings to reduce CO2, but in the process, put people back to work. We won that in 1994. And since that program was initiated, that has created over 46,000 person years worth of work and reduced CO2 emissions by 680,000 tons. And what that taught us is that our skills can be used to build the skylines of New York or Toronto or any other part of this world and build those well, or we can continue to build the same stuff that's going to harm our environment and our process of our world. And let's make the right choice. So that experience gave me the confidence as a union leader to help craft a green jobs paper, strategy paper. And the Canadian Labour Congress in 1999 was the first central labor body in the world to adopt a comprehensive green job strategy. And that place was full of loggers and forestry workers, of miners, of smelters, of chemical workers, of construction workers. And yet we were able to craft an agreement that this process would include everybody. In 1999, the loggers on the West Coast were locked in a horrific battle with the deep green activists who were spiking trees and saying no to clear cutting. Both sides had something righteous to think about, but they couldn't get to that right place. But we sat down with the loggers in that convention and said, it's not going to be construction folks from the big cities of Toronto or Montreal. They're going to tell you how to design a forest products industry future. You'll be the ones driving that agenda. And then we were able to remind that in 1949, their union had actually published a book called Green Gold, How the Forests Can Be Managed to Sustain Jobs for Generations to Come. And simply asked that they look back at the steps that inspired and thoughtful leaders had taken before and imagine sustainable forestry so that their communities could exist and they would be in charge of designing the program, not environmentalists by themselves, not people from the cities, but people in those communities. Next slide, please. If we look at, I think you got to click twice on this. We know where the greenhouse gases come from. I don't have to preach to you that climate change is real or that we understand the sources of those greenhouse gases. We have some tremendous work being done by our European friends, and we drew a lot of ideas from the European trade union movement as we developed from that point in time. But in Toronto as well, we also were addressing the issue of waste. One of our mayors, you may have heard of Mel Lastman, he was kind of a crazy guy, not as bad as our crack smoking mayor later on. But his solution to the mounting amount of waste, and we were running out of landfills, was to ship it in a train up to Northern Ontario and pour it into a lake. It's called Adams Mine. And the people of those areas, of course, resisted. The Indigenous people resisted. And our union stepped up and said, yep, that's the wrong thing. We will be allies to the environmental movement and the residents of Northern Ontario saying, no, we've got a different approach. Let's reduce our solid waste. Let's come up with a program called organic waste diversion. And our national union, CUPE, which is like your AFSCME, went to the city of Toronto with a plan to move to organics diversion. And of course, the powers that be said, well, hold on a second. You guys are just unions looking to have more jobs and create more CUPE jobs. You don't really care about the environment. And they went off and they still tried to push this notion of shipping our garbage to Adam's Mine. And when we defeated that, they created a task force and they brought in a number of experts and they went around and held hearings. And they come back a year later. And what that task force recommended was exactly the program that the Municipal Workers Union had proposed on organic waste diversion. And today, something like 90% of organic waste in Toronto is moved out and created into compost that's used back in farming. It's not thrown in the waste. So we understood that it's not just construction workers doing retrofits or doing solar that can bring these solutions forward, but people from all spaces and all walks of life that are addressing the global sources of greenhouse gas. Our schools started to think about a program called Eco Schools. And in 2002, the school board in Toronto spearheaded a comprehensive approach to imagining every aspect of schooling and what that could do to lighten the footprint, but also teach young people about the urgency of climate action. In 2006, the Blue-Green Alliance was created in the US, and I was honored to be in Pittsburgh for the founding of that, the attempt of labor and the environmental movement to come together, and similar to the Apollo Alliance in the States, to come together and come up with solutions. But the financial collapse of 2008 seemed to put us backwards. Because as people were frustrated and angry with the choices made, and in your space, the Tea Party was funded by the oil billionaires and started to move back the needle, and people like Van Jones, who were coming into the White House to help do a visionary program of climate justice, including racial justice. Van got sidelined because of the attack by Republicans and the right. We had steps backwards, and we had to figure out a new way forward. In 2012, trade unionists in your city came together to create Trade Unionists for Energy Democracy. And they gathered energy workers from all around the world to say, we want a different outcome. Yes, we are energy workers. Yes, we create gas and coal and oil and electricity, and we want it done a better way, and we want more public accountability. And in fact, we want it under public control. That's the only true way to ensure that we will have energy democracy, where the people can determine the future of how energy is played out. In around that same time, I went to Los Angeles to visit a fabulous organization called the Los Angeles Alliance for New Economy, that was imagining a future economic change with good jobs and equity at its core. And they had just gone through a referendum vote to raise $34 billion to expand transit across LA into the Latino and African American communities. And they put together an amazing coalition to win, and I couldn't believe this, a referendum, 80%, to raise the sales tax by 1% to invest in that broad transit system. They put together politicians, construction workers, the rest of the union movement, some of the business leaders, the community leaders, and they said, we will also make sure that the jobs that are created here, there will be opportunities for young Black and brown youth to come into the skilled trades and be part of this prosperity. And that clinched the deal for faith leaders, for community activists, for anti-poverty groups, for anti-racist activists to be part of that broad coalition to support that initiative on climate. And I came back to Toronto, and we were about to embark on a major transit expansion as well. And I sat down with the people in charge and said, this is a very interesting idea about looking at an affirmative action program as we move forward on this transit. Transit's going to be good for the environment. It's going to be good for the economy. It's going to be good for neighborhoods. Let's make sure there aren't young kids in those poor neighborhoods, those primarily Black neighborhoods or newcomer neighborhoods, standing at the chain link fence looking in while people are driving 100 miles to work on that job from somewhere else. And that created our Toronto Community Benefits Network, which has now succeeded in negotiating major community benefits programs for infrastructure projects. You have a similar one in New York City. I was then lucky enough to come to New York and march in the People's Climate March in 2014. And the trade unionists that were in that march, all of them pointed to Hurricane Sandy and said, we learned something. Before that, a conversation about climate and environment was an abstract conversation. But the head of the New York nurses talked about being in the operating room, doing her shift as Sandy hit and the victims were flooding into hospitals. And she was receiving calls from the leaders of the nurses union in different hospitals that are shutting down because they were losing power during the flooding. And she said, you know, for us, climate became a health emergency on the day of Hurricane Sandy. And that's why we're here. And union after union said the same thing. Not long after that, we were in Paris and we saw the incredible ambition of political leaders to say, we're going to do this. I visited the industry side. There's always an expo of industry, of new technologies and green technologies at these COP events. And I'll always remember being at one of the booths, and it was a huge French multinational company. But the guy behind it was a British guy from not far from where my parents are. And I struck up a conversation, told him who I was. I said, well, how come you're here, representing this huge French multinational? He said, well, it's simple. We have something like 32 facilities across the world. The one I manage is the most energy efficient. I said, well, how did that come to be? Well, you said, you're a trade unionist. The Trade Union Congress in Britain has created something called environmental reps. They've been funded by the government. They help us. They sit down with us and tell us about how we can move to energy efficiency in the production. And in return, there's a commitment that if we're more productive, there's 3 or 4 people don't get a pink slip, don't get laid off, their time and energy gets reinvested back into becoming even more energy efficiency. That's how we did it. And that notion of empowering workers to be part of identifying the solutions is very much the mirror image of that journey of health and safety that I described before. And that's a core part of what we believe we have to do in the future. So empowering workers. You know the slogan, nothing about us without us. And workers have to be the core of this. I have many good friends in New York who 2018 created Climate Jobs New York. It's a coalition today that represents 2.6 million union members with a shared goal of combating climate change while reversing income inequality at the scale that climate science demands, while creating good union jobs and supporting more equitable communities. And I urge you to go and look at Climate Jobs New York and the work they're doing. That's expanded, in fact, across now to the Climate Jobs National Resource Center that Mike Fishman is heading up today. How do we get there? It's about political will. There's another great book I'm going to tell you about. Seth Klein is a Canadian author, recently wrote a book called A Good War. Now, how on earth could be such a thing as a good war? Well, he was describing the efforts in the Second World War of Canada as a nation to build up to the production and activity that was necessary to win the fight against fascism, to win the fight against Nazism. What they did in creating 28 crown corporations, public companies that undertook immense work in all sectors of our economy to ensure that something got done. And when the minister at the time was asked, how on earth can we go into this unprecedented level of debt to finance this? How can we do that? What about the cost? The cabinet minister says, but if we lose the war, nothing else matters. And we would say similarly, and Seth Klein says, if we lose this war against the climate emergency, nothing else will matter. We've got to do it. Next slide, please. And for Canada, those of you who know Canada, that's our beloved national institution, Tim Hortons Coffee. And when you can't get to Tim's because your neighborhood is flooded, it tells you this emergency is real. Next slide, please. So we know where GHG comes from. This is Canada's. The picture is a little different in different parts of the world. We have a large, obviously, piece of oil and gas in different parts of our country. But we've got to tackle every single space that greenhouse gases come from, every single activity that generates emissions. And that's not just about jobs for the boys in construction. It's not just for people like me putting up solar panels or retrofitting buildings or building new transit. It's about every kind of piece of work we do in hospitals and hotels and schools, in supermarkets. every kind of human activity is part of the problem and has to be part of the solution. Next slide, please. And our union of postal workers in Canada a couple of years ago generated one of the most thoughtful just transition programs. Imagining Canada Post, our national postal operation, transitioning from what it is today to something that is a crucial part of climate solution. They have the largest fleet of trucks in this country, and they want them moved to all electric vehicles. They want those vehicles built in Canada. They want the technology assembled here so there's jobs for those folks. They want every post office, and we have more post offices in Canada than Tim Hortons coffee shops, every post office to have solar on top and be an electric generating station so people can buy electric cars or run electric trucks and be able to charge them as you go across the sparse density of Northern Ontario or the prairies or any other part of this country. They want postal banking so that people can have income security in small towns when banks have left and all there is the payday loan companies. They want food security programs to be built into the delivery of what our post office does. It's a remarkable concept of taking a current operation and transitioning to something dramatically different. Next slide, please. So we created something called the Green Print for Greater Toronto. It's at laborcouncil.ca/climate. And it's a view of how we take every sector of the economy in Greater Toronto and we imagine transitioning to a low carbon future. I'm a construction worker. We work from blueprints, but this is a green print to get to a greener economy that we wrote after Paris. Next slide, please. So there's some lessons about just transition. First, and these come from the task force, and they also come from the work of the International Trade Union Confederation Just Transition Center. If you want working people to buy into this and you want it to be successful, if you want to move to a net zero economy, you have to have income support for workers during the full duration. Secondly, you have to local economic development tools for affected communities. People have seen way too many ghost towns in the Midwest, in parts of Canada, in Atlantic Canada and Northern Ontario. Our local economy has to be sustained. Third, realistic training and retraining programs that lead to decent work, not just a job flipping hamburgers at the local McDonald's. Next slide, please. We have to have knowledge sharing in the adoption of best practices from other jurisdictions I've mentioned. We've learned from Europe, we've learned from New York, we've learned from California, we've learned from every place we possibly can to get this right. Next, a framework to support labor standards and collective bargaining. I was shocked. Most of our solid waste in Toronto is all publicly picked up and delivered. I was shocked in LA that much of the solid waste work, including the recycling, was done by poverty wage, often undocumented workers for temp agencies. You have to have labor standards and workers' rights and workers' agency in the new workforce. And then you have to have a sectoral approach, customized to regions and workplaces. There's no one size fit all in this. Our economy is unbelievably complex and sophisticated, and you have to go sector by sector by sector to understand what the solution is going to look like. Next slide. There's R&D involved. I mean, we are looking at, net zero buildings. When I was in Paris in 2015, we were thinking about net zero communities. There was examples by French engineering companies of already having built net zero communities up and running and tested. And that technology, we have to embrace that quickly and sustain it and make sure that we're moving to it. Technology does not provide a silver bullet, but is crucial to moving to net zero. And then finally, if you don't have racial justice, you're doing the wrong thing. We have to take an equity lens to every aspect of what we're doing to understand and address the impacts on racialized and Indigenous communities and the reality of systemic racism and the impact of colonialism on the First Peoples in the Americas. Next slide, please. So it's got to be about a job-rich transition. That's the new language that we're using in these struggles, a job-rich transition in order to make sure that what we get is what we want. Just transition is a long-term commitment from all aspects, all societies to prepare for the future. The reality is that corporate power will have to be challenged and curtailed, just as I talked about that long journey of addressing corporate globalization. Or maybe the entire system has to be changed. I'll leave that up to you to debate and discuss. But it's going to require people with courage and knowledge. It's going to be a political fight. Just over a century ago, thousands of women poured out of the textile factories in Lawrence, Massachusetts, demanding a living wage, dignity, and union rights. Their cry, in a multitude of languages, for bread and roses was captured forever in the anthem celebrated every year on International Women's Day, which is coming up on March 8th. In a way, that's always been the goal of working people. Faced with the greed and power of the 1%, doesn't matter what century, but we can neither grow roses nor the wheat for bread unless this planet is able to sustain itself and all of humankind. It's with that in mind, I would invite all of you to be part of a vital yet daunting journey. We need to shape history together as we confront the crisis of globalization, as we seek to unlock the power that will truly make another world possible. I hope you'll join me in that journey. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much. It's kind of funny not to be able to hear applause from the audience, but thank you very much for that thought-provoking and inspiring talk. I want to throw it to the audience and see if there are questions. You can either type your question in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen, or if you use the raised hand function, also at the bottom of the screen, we will recognize you and ask you to unmute yourself, and you can actually ask a question in the old-fashioned traditional way. Sam Friedman.
Yeah, that was a lovely talk. There is one area that I felt you didn't address, which is that when you really look at who and what the biggest polluters are, high up on that list is the military.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, what are your suggestions on how we address that?
Well, as I said, I was an infantry sergeant in the reserves here, but I became a peace activist because I watched not just, the horrible things that had been done through wars, but I watched the unbelievable waste of ordnance that happens in any military venture. And frankly, we all have to tackle the power that's behind military spending in all our countries. We have to, take what Trump was doing and ratcheting up military and arms spending and ratchet it down significantly. That's where we're going to find billions and billions of dollars to invest in the kind of green economic future that I talked about.
My question, though, is how do we actually succeed in doing that?
Well, that's called a peace movement, and it's the same as a climate justice movement or a civil rights movement or an anti-racial movement or an indigenous rights movement. We've got to link these things together. It's about power. It's about finding the commonalities of people. It's about having a strategic plan, about engaging people to give power to that plan, and having alliances that will make you more powerful than the people with the money who are currently driving that agenda.
Anyone else have a question? Yeah, Gordon, is that you? Oh, where'd you go?
Maybe I spoke.
Yes, go ahead. Unmute yourself and. Yes.
Okay. So I really liked your lecture. Thank you for that. I'm curious as to why you think that our future is a job-rich transition. It kind of makes me wonder how this is gonna fit with your narrative about how corporations have been damaging our planet for all this time. Because if we want a job-rich transition, then that means we're gonna depend on these corporations to provide us with these jobs. If I'm understanding correctly.
No.
But no.
No.
So yeah, I was just wondering what you meant by that.
Sure. So, in Canada, we have a much deeper history of public enterprise, of public institutions, and that's what Seth Klein points to in the Good War, is a need to create public institutions, public enterprise. In the LEAP manifesto that you may have heard of Naomi Klein, and I was a signatory to, and our Labor Council and movement was a signatory to LEAP manifesto. They speak about caring work as very much part of the new economy, of massive investment in childcare, of allowing people in the caring economy, in healthcare, in long-term care, to have decent jobs, not juggling 2 or 3 poverty wage jobs, but having decent jobs with wages and benefits to sustain that, and expanding the caring economy as well. And we would say, you know, the expansion of public transit, the expansion of publicly owned utilities, and as the trade unions for energy democracy saying, actually taking back control over all forms of energy, putting that under public control. Those are what moves you, you know, at different place. I said somewhere there, I mean, it may mean changing the entire system. And that's the question that we need to ask ourselves. In this time of obscene corporate power and unbelievable wealth that's amassing to a handful of people, how do we tackle income inequality and the degradation of the environment without challenging the power that corporations have? That's a political fight for a different kind of future.
So actually, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask kind of a follow-up question to
Sure.
that, which is when you showed the slides of the sources of emissions, the vast majority of the industries that are responsible, or the vast majority of the pollution is from industries where the workers tend to be men. Mm-hmm. And the home, what was kind of in that category of then home and business, or home and buildings, are where women have traditionally worked. And of course, there's the care work that you just alluded to, which is frequently gendered to be done by women. And so I wonder how, when you think about this transition, in some ways the transition from kind of polluting work to clean work seems to be also a transition from historically masculine work to historically feminized work. I wonder, how do you think about that when you're talking to your members who are men and you're talking about how we need more care work? How do you talk about the work that they and their sons are going to need to valorize, are going to need to celebrate?
Well, that's a really good point, but I will start by reiterating the slogan: transition is assured, justice is not. There used to be 30,000 men working in Hamilton Steelworks of Stelco, and today there's 1,200. There used to be 20,000 miners in Sudbury working for Inco, that's now Valley. Today there's less than 3,000 turning out the same amount of ore. So our work is getting displaced no matter what. And the question is, what is the new undertakings that people can do for guys that look like me, that have been on the journey like me? And, you know, I go back to that 46,000 years worth of work that we created doing energy retrofits that nobody would have ever believed. When we first started that, my members are saying, John, come on now. I thought you were a carpenter, not some granola crunch and tree hugger. Like, you know, come on, we're talking about real jobs. But when people who were, you know, out of EI and employment insurance and, you know, and desperate, suddenly were called back to work to go and rip out the old mechanical systems, electrical systems, or reskin that building, and people whose apprenticeships were stalled, so that, you know, and they were back now finishing their time, they are saying, wow, this is fabulous. There's a group in Alberta called Iron and Ore. Those are unemployed tradespeople who lost jobs there, who are saying, we have alternatives. We can go back to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and green up all the existing buildings, and those jobs will be there. But, you know, it's also intended on us to look at the issues of consumerism, because that's a huge driver of the processes, and whether or not the emissions are created here or in China, or if it's too expensive in China, in Bangladesh, or too expensive in Bangladesh to go to Vietnam, right? Holding what we call the extended producer responsibility, going back and saying to a company, if you produce this, you're responsible for the life cycle of that good. That means that people will do recycling work and reclaiming of product. And if it's done with a framework of labor standards and justice and global solidarity between workers, you know, that's the path forward. It means that in North America, we have to think about working people in Bangladesh, in Vietnam, in other locations, And, we have to understand that the push-pull of migration, as I started to talk about, is that people are coming in convoys, are trying to get in the States because of what the system did, what power did to their villages and their homes. And we got to be part of that solution as well.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Declan, go ahead.
You hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, cool. So you mentioned labor solidarity between people across regions, and I'm wondering because coming from where I am, which is in Massachusetts, I do know a lot of people in unions and labor unions, and while they have a lot of solidarity between themselves, some of them do seem to have some not solidarity with laborers that are in other countries or in other regions, and I wonder how we begin to build the solidarity between people who, may not have it right now or may be able to. I wonder what work can be done to build the solidarity so that we can have this push for a just transition.
Well, that's the age-old question, going back centuries is, and we celebrate May 1st, May Day, because there was an international movement at the time trying to win an 8-hour day. And in Chicago, in Haymarket, a terrible situation, people died. We celebrate International Women's Day across this world. In fact, to go back to the textile workers, as they marched and sang and spoke for bread and roses. And our movement, it was Germans who said, we want to declare March 8th as an International Women's Day. And we want working people across the world to understand that we should not be played off against each other. It's really hard when you're in a country, whether it's the States now, or Britain or France before, that ran an empire. The working class in those countries gets a sense they're part of a particular project. And it's much harder for workers in countries like that to reach out to people in other parts of the world and say, yeah, we're going to be there with you. I have a great image in my mind of a picture when Gandhi from India, when they were leading the cotton boycott in India and telling, we don't want to buy any British cotton produce, of him going to the textile mills in Lancashire and being greeted by mill workers, even though it was going to impact on their livelihood, of saying, we support Indian independence and we support the right of Indians to have justice. In my mother's town of Rochdale, in northern Lancashire, is the home of the cooperative movement. But during the American Civil War, when the blockade was taking place, the North was blockading trading of cotton to Lancashire. There was something called a cotton famine. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs. They were desperate. People were starving. And all across, there was the cotton owners were saying, demand that our government break the blockade and side with the cotton owners so you can keep working. And the working people of Rochdale and Manchester wrote open letters to the American people saying, we stand with the fight against slavery. That's the spirit we got to draw upon. If you've seen, there's a great movie about a slaving ship, Amistad, that as it unfolds, and the constitutional expert, the lawyer, is trying to figure out how to ensure the freedom of those enslaved peoples. One of them gave advice. He said, when we try to figure things out, we look to our ancestors. There's tremendous experience and culture in the best of our labor movement. It's not there all the time. I got to acknowledge that. I come from the trades. I've seen lots of things that are not the best of our movement. But the best of our movement, when we are speaking different languages, when we are reaching out to workers in different parts of the world, when New York hotel workers are reaching out to workers in hotel workers in Indonesia or in Northern Africa, because it's the same chains that they're up against bargaining. Mm-hmm. That's how we build global solidarity. We have global union federations that help to do that. It doesn't mean that every rank and file worker understands that picture, but it's part of this kind of journey that we try and through a narrative explain to union members that this is a common journey we're on as humankind, and working people together are the ones that got to drive to a more just world. It's a long answer, but I thought I would add some historical anecdotes.
Thank you.
Well, I invited you here in my guise as a disaster scholar, but I'm trained as a labor and working class historian. And so it warms my heart to hear your repeated kind of invocations of labor history as part of the work you're doing now. It reminds me of the work that my colleagues and I as labor historians do actually matters sometimes. People are listening to us.
And the New York labor movement over many years has had, parts of it have a remarkable history. And challenging a lot of things that those in power wanted to maintain or wanted to put in place. And so we look back at our best times and we draw on those instincts and those values and make sure we're sharing that with people coming behind us.
I think that is probably a really lovely sentiment on which to end. So John Cartwright, thank you so much for opening this series, for sharing your ideas and your stories. I really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Good to be with you. And I know you're going to have smarter and younger speakers after me, but I'm glad and honored to help open up the series. Thanks.
Thank you.